good to go, yeah, just coffee, don't care, no, tough. I appreciate that just showing a slide that has 5 acronyms, of which 2 are completely idiosyncratic to me, is perhaps a level of abstraction a bit too far. So I just thought I would show you this. Keep this in mind, we'll come back to this later, and hopefully by the end of this 15 minutes it'll make more sense than it does currently. So, the inherent duality of the paper that I promised to do this morning really necessitates some introduction to 2 distinct areas of scholarly investigation which pretty much cover the opposite ends of the spectrum of human intellectual endeavor. Now, at one end, we have the narratives which unfold in the content of the literary compositions which are written in Sumerian and published on the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which I will henceforth refer to as ASOR, because that's what Steve Tinney does, and Steve Tinney is cool. At the other end of this spectrum is then the linked open data that we keep hearing about, and the digital pragmatics and online publication paradigms, which it really stands for. We're really looking at something that has been talked about in the artificial intelligence community since the 1960s onwards, but it never really manifested, in my opinion, to the same extent, in the same kind of way as linked open data is making it happen right now. And since this is quite a niche audience, I'm not going to engage in my usually favorite thing about this talk, which is a prelude which puts the fear of cuneiform into people. But I'm not going to talk about the wonders of the cuneiform script or the amazing affordances and challenges of a multi-millennial and polyglot literary history. What I am going to talk about, I'm sure you'll all be thrilled to hear, the practicalities of linked open data. And then I'm going to carry on to do some evaluative, comparative analysis of a few ontologies, and with like sort of Sumerian case studies and examples dotted in here and there as I go along. And breathe. So, linked open data, it's a method for publishing data online, is what is really a step beyond machine readable, more towards something that is a machine understandable format. It's not really revolutionary per se, because it was always at the back of the brilliant mind of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who is, as we all know, is the inventor of the HTTP protocol and the first person to really implement this cluster of hyperlinked documents, which has grown into what we know as the World Wide Web, and on which we all, certainly I, have become utterly dependent on in the last 2 decades. The original web of documents has become increasingly semantic, and the sort of 5-star open or linked open data standard really requires and promotes not only the publication of data online, but doing so in open, non-proprietary formats, using HTTP URIs. Both those terms are defined in your handout sheets, and using technologies such as RDF, also defined, so that you can link similar datasets, or datasets which contain similar or the same entities together. Okay, so nothing is ever easy. Let's get that out of the way. And this interconnectedness and linking of data requires an underlying understanding of the concepts that are being connected. Thank you for everyone who smirked at this amazing Photoshop job. Clearly, I respect artists' copyright on their work, especially after they've died. Anyway, to enable future things such as automated inferencing or the discovery of implicit information from explicitly declared facts, we really need to have an understanding not just as human users, but also so that the machines can understand the differences that we're trying to cover. So, for example, and why I chose this image, is that we need to explain to computers why a physical archaeological object such as a cuneiform tablet and its creator are vastly different things from a high-resolution digital photograph of that object and its creator. Now, it's obvious to us with our human brains that those 2 people are going to be thousands of years apart, but to a machine we have to explain this in terms of having non-ambiguous and very clear, unique identifiers for both the objects, I would argue, and the people themselves. And capturing the details and the metadata about the objects, and I mean both archaeological objects and digital objects, and capturing the relationships between things in data sets obviously necessitates the kind of structural framework that we've already been hearing about today. I was going to go on to have an explanation about what ontologies are and what they do, but since we've already kind of touched on that topic today, I'm not going to do that. So if you're not sure and the handout doesn't tell you, come and find me afterwards. I am so happy to talk about this until I sort of fall over. Which I'm about to do. Right. The rich, heterogeneous, incomplete, and unknown data that is Sumerian Literarycorpora presents some challenges not only to philologists, but also to narratologists and computer sciences too. I would argue that this kind of technical determinist, reductionist method is unlikely to effectively capture all the subtlety and the nuances that's embedded in those texts, and which I believe that people like me who study them really think is part of their charm. My case study example for my thesis was a joke where there was no punchline because the tablet was broken. So that was a bit of a perpetual anticlimax. If you didn't catch what, well, my PhD. Right, excuse me. Right, so there are obviously unavoidable biases, lots of interpretive features which come into the study not only of narratives, but also into the development and design of ontologies. And those are even more increased when you bring those together. That is, these features of Literarycorpora make them suitable as case study examples. They are relevant and they are unique in their capacity to test the robustness and the inclusiveness of ontological models which are being developed today with the promise of universality. And I would say that narratives in particular, although it has been quite a tricky subject, I certainly found it more challenging in lots of ways than just dealing with object metadata, which I did previously and subsequently. I still think that these narratives are alive and well today. We need to have a greater awareness of them. And I would argue that recently we have seen that a powerful narrative can have an extreme amount of power over the minds and the opinions of the masses. Now, we all know, I'm sure, that the examples of intertextuality, of borrowings and allusions can be observed across the entirety of the Mesopotamian literary corpus. And these quotes and intertextual examples also span across what I sort of hesitantly have called genres of literature. We can have a long discussion as to why genre probably isn't the right word. My example here is between epic narratives and proverb collections. They also seem to span space and time, which is illustrated by this recurring motif of the donkeys and the king's son. These are, of course, the types of examples of research questions that a semantic representation of literary narratives can help us uncover. And I hasten to add that it's obviously not the kind of scholarship that a human mind couldn't do, but as human beings, we have a finite amount of time, like we all have a best before date. And my work looks at building tools and having projects which makes the data retrieval and the information discovery stages faster, so that then my time and everybody else's time is freed up to do the sort of cognitive processing that only the human mind can currently do. So I hope you will indulge me this little brief step into narrative theory, and just on a quick comment on the identification of narrative motives within a story. Now, the ontologies that I'm going to talk about later rely very heavily on the work of Prop, who worked with Russian fairy tales, which is modern depictions here. And there's also, of course, the work of people like Arne Thompson and the classification system for folklore motif indexing. I would argue that in some instances, the classifications are actually more specific than universal, but because we have traditionally had a very specific sort of perspective, it always hasn't been entirely clear that that's what's happening. So, and I think that makes the use of these ontologies a little bit tricky sometimes, and it's not, the assignment of entities to specific classes is not always entirely unambiguous. If we look at these images, we can sort of make arguments about a person standing in the snow is an unlikely motive to occur in Mesopotamian literature. But I would sort of take that further and say, can we say things like, okay, in a lot of fairy tale narratives, we have a concept of a hero or a Prince Charming. Can we apply that to Gilgamesh? I would sort of say, well, we shouldn't, because his development from as an anti-hero through a process of personal growth into something great is a really fundamental part of what makes his eponymous epic so compelling thousands of years later. And this next slide is for Eric. Oh, no. So the ontological models have a great deal of inherent flexibility, and that makes it, which is made possible by technologies such as RDF. But in terms also makes them the sort of ideal solution for the sort of complex and incomplete data that the narrative material really is. And that led me eventually, after a primary investigation, to come up with this hypothesis, which is that existing domain-specific ontologies, even if they're focusing on one particular thing, which are always inevitably designed from this omniscient perspective. When we design ontologies, we believe that we know everything that there is to know about a domain. Even with these things taken into consideration, we can still say that they are in fact suitable for the representation of the heterogeneous, incomplete, and unknown narratives that we know from Sumerian literary compositions. And this is really where the exciting stuff starts. So we've already seen the SeaDuck CRM briefly today. I'm going to go ahead and assume, thank you, that most of you are at least vaguely acquainted with it. If not, it is a fairly large ontology. It is event-based, and it focuses on capturing cultural heritage data. There's also several extensions to it, some for archaeology, some for slightly different sort of data. It is very large. It is very comprehensive. I like to describe it as containing everything but the kitchen sink. When I started the process, I assumed that I would be using the SeaDuck CRM extensively. But as it turned out, it ended up being a bridging ontology for me. The two others that I will talk about momentarily were actually both purposely designed to meet and match up and link with the SeaDuck CRM, and it's also my gateway ontology for linking to data that's elsewhere on the web. The second one, which might be somewhat interesting and surprising, is actually Ferber, which is an ontology for capturing bibliographic metadata. And this is something that's more of I think, a feature of the ETSOL rather than anything else, which is that in the data that they publish, there are extensive records for the secondary sources and other publications, which I think is a really valuable, enriching aspect to the data. And I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to represent just the content of the narrative inscriptions. I wanted to capture all of the ETSOL data. The third one, then, will be one which I don't think many of you will have heard of. It's a little known but very large in size ontology, which was developed by some predecessors of mine at the University of Southampton. It's an upper-level ontology designed specifically for capturing narrative in fiction. And it, too, like the other two, as I already said, was massive, but it's actually been divided into lots of little sub-ontologies, so you have some more freedom to choose what you want to go with. This ontology in particular was largely influenced by the work of Prop. But it grew exponentially when they started adding things that are from the remit of science fiction and fantasy. So there are features in that ontology and entities and classes which are largely superfluous, such as traveling through wormholes. So if you ever need an ontology to represent traveling through wormholes, it already exists. Don't reinvent the wheel. But there were things that were actually surprisingly interesting. So I never thought that some traveling through air might be relevant. But then when you look at the actual narratives that are somewhere like ETSOL, you'll actually see that, hey, there are kings flying on the backs of eagles and so forth. It's pretty cool stuff. This one, then, is my own creation. It's not a terribly great diagram. I will be the first person. I thought I would put this up as a historical document. This is what it looks like in my thesis from all those years ago. I wanted to create Sola, which is the narrative of the Sumerian literature ontology, because I wanted to build a bottom-up structure that would be guaranteed to capture all the information that was in the data set and make sure that just because it wasn't in any of the other three, that it wouldn't just disappear and be missed out. It is, I am fully willing to admit, a specialization within a specialization within a specialization. So back to the original, somewhat scary slide that I showed at the start. Makes more sense. Morsel is then the multi-ontology of the representation of Sumerian literature, which brings together the four other ontologies that I've briefly described. It's an incredibly clever pun, in case you didn't get it, because all the other ones, like all the four, are massive. And then when you bring them together, it's even bigger, so I called it morsel. no matter how often I tell that joke, it never gets funny. I'm gonna have to work on that. So yes. Okay. So what's my takeaway message? Since I'm running out of time, I hear you. My takeaway message is actually an emphatic plea for the future of our discipline. I think Assyriological scholarship is really rich. It's really interesting. It's got a lot of value that it can bring to a much wider stage of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research. But in order to get there, we really, honestly, genuinely need to move away from this existing culture of publishing data online in a display-only fashion. It's what I like to call look with your eyes, not with your machine publication paradigm. And I really think that in order for us to be able to tap into all the great things that RDF and other semantic web technologies will enable us to do, we can only do that through having access to open data. We talk about it a lot. Eric and Sarah are like the people to talk to about that. They're right here. You should talk to them. They will help you get started. They will help you do all that. My work starts where like open data happens. So I might be preaching to the choir, but honestly, let's put our data online, let's reuse, let's innovate, and let's not disappear down this dystopian hole of irrelevance on a global scale. That's it. Thank you very much.